Now it's time for today's perspective, and we're going to encourage you today to look at your inner self, your own self-worth, if you like. How do you measure it? Well, for many, it's about money, or for others, perhaps it's about love. For others, it's about accomplishments. But my guest today says we need to move our focus from having to being. Her book, Seeing Others, How to Redefine Worth in a Divided World, is by the renowned Harvard sociologist, Michèle Lamont, and she joins us now on the programme. Thanks very much for talking to us. First of all then, just tell us about why people traditionally measure, do you think, their self-worth with things like money, with accomplishment. What's wrong with that, do you think?
Well, it mostly has to do with the fact that we have come to define who's worthy based on diplomas and on professional success. And this leaves more than 50% of the population, those who are in the bottom half, to feel really stigmatized, alienated. They don't have a sense of dignity. And this is partly what feeds the popularity of the radical right with the working class. So the focus of the book is not psychological. I'm a sociologist. It's really more about how can we make, we look at the cultural industries to see what are the ideas that are put out there that help us broaden our understanding of who's worthy, to move from a focus on money toward a more multidimensional understanding of who matters. And what we've seen over the last 10 years or so is really a growing focus on inclusion, which is frankly exactly what the radical right governments are now targeting. It's very clear in the case of Trump. So in some ways, it's a book that is inviting us to really understand what's happening now with these, on the one hand, the celebration of a much broader understanding of who's worthy, and with Trump, basically a turn back toward a much narrower vision that emphasizes success.
So let's talk, first of all, about the person, then we'll talk about the politics, if you like. If you're an individual and you're listening to what you're saying there and thinking, yes, I completely agree with this, how can you turn your mind to thinking along those lines if perhaps the rest of the world isn't doing the same thing?
Well, the book's penultimate chapters are really helping people to understand what recognition is about first and what can feed it. And one of the things that really gets in the way is social segregation, when we have very few contacts with people from other classes whose life is very different. And in this context, it's very easy to vilify people. So in some ways, if you think of upper middle class people who send their kids to posh schools, it's a cry, it's really, calling people to broaden their social networks and gain a better understanding of what other people's lives are like. So that would be one element. Another one is what in the book I call ordinary universalism, focus on what we all share with other human beings. So for another book, I did interviews with North African immigrants in France who had a very low level of education. And when for this book I asked them, what do you have in common with French people? They turned to basic self-evident things they could see in their everyday life, like we all have to get up in the morning to buy our bread. We all have 10 fingers. We all spend 9 months in our mother's womb. We're all children of God. So we can move, the book is really a call to emphasize more what we share all as human beings, as opposed to focusing on hierarchies and differences in status.
Yeah, let's talk then about the politics. You mentioned Donald Trump. I mean, there are other figures around the world we could talk about, not least the far right here in France as well. I mean, how do you think the book plays out in the current political context where people are turning towards more far right leaders and more populist leaders?
Well, I decided to write the book during the first Trump presidency precisely because it was gaining a lot of popularity with workers. And still today, a lot of what he does is appeal to them. So for instance, this morning, in response to the notion that very few of the nuclear armaments in Iran would have been destroyed, he said, this is an insult to the dignity of the pilots who were driving driving these planes. So I think he's constantly talking to his base, and he spends a whole lot of time providing a worldview that strengthen what workers want to hear. People who feel like the liberals, they're progressive, have totally misunderstood what are the challenges that workers have today. So I think basically to fight back against the radical right, this is not original, but it needs to be repeated time and time again. Liberals and progressive have really to reconnect with this deep feeling of being disrespected that is so central to the experience of the non-college educated today. And the book really tries to highlight why this is and how can we go around this to avoid, getting, for instance, the far right elected in France in 2027.
So do you think if people were to read the book and take on board what you're saying, that a lot of people would sort of regain their respect for themselves, regain their dignity?
I think it's less about regaining their dignity because, frankly, it's a book that is more likely to be read by people who are college educated, although it's really a trade book. I wrote it for the general reader. But it's about them understanding what is recognition and what is stigmatization and how it plays so deeply. It has a crucial role in everyday politics, and not enough people understand how this works. So the goal is really to help people understand what we can do, how are the representation who's valuable produced in our society, and in what ways can we orient them and contribute to them in such a way that more people feel included. So although it has a lot of implication for politics, it's really more about the general production of our understanding of who belongs, who's valued, and who's stigmatized, and how the boundaries between groups, whether ethno-racial or class or religious, can be made much more porous so that our attitudes are less exclusive and less disrespectful of people who don't have everything that is valued in our society, going from, a high level of consumption to, higher education.
I wanted to end by asking a little bit about yourself as well. I mean, being a sociologist, you mentioned you wrote a lot of this during the first term of Donald Trump, but where does it come from in you? Where did your interest, if you like, in the human psyche originally come from, would you say?
Well, I'm a French Canadian. I grew up during the peak of the nationalist movement, which was very much of a progressive movement. I grew up at the boundary between English and French Canada, and I really saw the boundaries between groups being transformed. And I've taught in the U.S. my whole life at elite university, at Princeton and at Harvard, and I have seen these boundaries very much, play out. And of course, going through Black Lives Matter and everything, working closely all the time with Gen Zs, I've decided to devote my life to working precisely on these questions of how to transform group boundaries. And thinking that it's happening you cannot just tell people, do yoga, do mindfulness, everything's going to go better. It's really more about thinking about how we can transform our societies in such ways that the messages that we're being exposed to move us toward a more pluralistic understanding of who's worthy.
Good to talk to you on the programme today. Thank you very much for giving us your thoughts and your ideas there. Harvard sociologist Michèle Lamont joining us there. She's been, in fact, at a conference here in Paris over the last few days. But thanks very much for being with us once again.